Hello, welcome to this video which is looking at theory in relation to group practice. This is a summary of some of the main points from the seminar for Module 1. If you're able to look at LearnLine and open up the PowerPoint for Seminar 2, that's what I'm looking at the moment. We're looking at what the importance of having theory in relation to generally to human service practice, and why do we need to have an idea about theory. And it's really, as you will know from your other studies, that theory is like a set of ideas that describes and explains our knowledge of the world around us in an organised way. And in social work theory, it's one that helps us to do or understand social work. The importance of having theory in our practice for all human service workers is that we base our practice on underlying assumptions, and our theoretical frameworks inform and guide us, and they also inform our practice, the types of interventions or assessment that we want to use. They also inform the way that we approach groups and the way that we run groups. There's different types of theory. So there's the formal theory that's written about in books. There's the practice theory that we each develop from our own practice and our experience over time. And then we can have personal theories as well that might be our assumptions about the way things are and how things are. And that's obviously influenced by our own culture, our nationality, our religious, our family background. All of those things will influence also our own personal theories. So the formal theory that's common in group work, a lot of that comes from individual work as well, and those theories influence how groups are conducted and the role of groups. And the set text introduction to group work has a couple of chapters, particularly chapter 2. If you read that, that summarises really well the different types of theories that we're going to be looking at briefly today. Firstly, we're going to have a look at systems theory, and I'm actually on slide 6 at the moment. And systems theory really looks at the group as a system of interacting elements. So looks at a group as a social system that has interdependent members that are working together, striking for equilibrium, at the same time as functioning as a whole. And that groups have to mobilise, need to get organised and change to survive. The purpose of the penguins on slide 8 is really important to notice how we all behave, how our behaviour is influenced and how our behaviour changes when we're actually in groups. How we think and feel is very much influenced in a different way when we're part of a group, when we're with others, to how we are on our own. Systems theory has got 4 major functional tasks for a group as a system. There's the integration, that the members fit together. There's the adaptation, that members are able to manage change, to cope. And there's pattern maintenance, so there's a sense of predictability. People know what happens in the group, and that sustains the purpose. There's also a goal, an outcome, that is what people in that group are striving for. The concepts around systems theory is that the existence of different properties of the group as a whole, they will come out, they will arise, they will emerge from the interactions of individual group members. The power effects of the group forces members' behaviour. So people's behaviour will slip in a particular way, a particular style, a particular pattern, because of the power of the group. And the struggle of the groups to maintain themselves as identities and entities when confronted with conflicts. The groups, I'm looking on slide 11 now, the groups must relate to an external environment. So how the group actually interacts or is influenced by the outside, as well as being attuned to and attending to what's happening within the group. And that also acknowledges that groups are in a constant state of becoming. they're developing, they're changing, and these things influence the equilibrium and the continued existence of the group, and that all groups have a developmental life cycle. When we're looking at psychodynamic theory, which has come out of very strong practice around psychoanalysis in an individual work, and you would perhaps be familiar with names such as Jung and Freud, Yalom. Psychodynamic theory in a group context looks at how group members can work on and act out or deal with unresolved life experiences. So the experience for people in psychodynamic theory can become part of being a group, can be a mini family experience, if you like, or a reflection of a family situation. The group leader often becomes or assumes a father figure role, and they use transference and counter-transference to enable the members to explore their past behaviour patterns. So, for example, the group leader in a psychodynamic group might actually challenge someone in the group and say, every time I speak, it sounds as though you get angry or you shut down. Is that one way that you responded to your father? That may not be a very good example, but in a way the group leader is quite directive and quite deliberate in the way that they use their position and their role in addressing issues in people's lives. Learning theory the primary focus is on the behaviour of the individual rather than the behaviour of the whole group, and it ignores or doesn't pay great attention to the importance of the group dynamics, that people are in the group to address the change of some behaviour. And it can be explained in different ways, that behaviour can be associated with stimulus, such as control. So certain things will happen in the group. People will respond in a certain way when people say certain words, and this will influence how people in the group behave. Operant conditioning, people respond to reactions, and social learning, people are observing with vicarious reinforcement, and this is happening in the context of the group. We are looking at each of these really quite briefly, and again I remind people that there's a huge area of study in each of these theories, and we're really just doing a very brief and cursory glance at each of these, but I encourage you, if you have an interest and you have an inkling that you may feel comfortable working in a way that works with one particular theoretical framework, that you decide you might want to explore that one further and read in more detail. Field theory looks at the group as a whole, as a gestalt, and an evolving entity of opposing forces. They act to hold members in the group and to move people along. It focuses on cohesion and keeping the forces that act on the group, the totality of the forces that act on the individual group keeps people in the group going. The principle suggests that individuals won't change their behaviour unless they see how their behaviour and attitude impacts on others and how others see them. So the power of how someone speaks, how someone interacts, how someone presents themselves, we're looking through field theory actually sees that a lot of those behaviours will be addressed as others respond to someone's way of being or way of speaking or way of behaving in the group. Social exchange theory is when people interact in groups and each person attempts to behave in a way that will maximise rewards and minimise punishments. Members initiate interactions because the exchange will reward them or provide them with something of value. And social exchange theory, you could argue that a group such as an Alcoholics Anonymous group, or a group that is looking at drug or alcohol use and people come to the group each week and they report how they're going. They report how they haven't been using or how they've cut down on their alcohol consumption, for example. That they will be rewarded and encouraged in that group by reporting that they've addressed their addiction. Narrative and constructivist theories are more recent, and these theories sit comfortably within the strengths-based framework. And these theories in the context of group work really focus on how group members create and maintain their identity and reality through stories about their lives. The notion that we all have stories about our lives, and sometimes those stories are quite negative. Narrative works with people in a way that looks at changing the way that we tell stories. The term that's used is re-storying. It acknowledges that there are richer and there are multi-layered stories that every person has, even people who've experienced hardship and awful things in their lives have got rich and strength-based stories. Narrative theory in terms of group work focuses on how to liberate people from the oppressive and destructive labels, and the way that the group is conducted is quite deliberate in how it tackles those issues. The next slide that I'm looking at is slide 19. It's just really asking you to think about, if you're thinking about these different theoretical frameworks, how might they influence your planning decisions, and what might be some of the things that you need to consider and think about if you are planning a different group, for example a parent group, and how that might differ to a group that actually deals with addiction. Looking at other theories, feminist theory and group work, Marxist theory and feminist theory also has influences on group work, and groups are conducted in a way that reflects an empowerment model that shares power. Also, they come from a position of recognising that women and oppressed people have not always been heard and haven't had a voice, and so the group is often a key place for people to have their voice heard. Structural issues such as patriarchy will influence how the group is facilitated. So things such as shared leadership, everyone having equal opportunity to speak, these practices have been very much influenced by feminist theory. Your own view of how you see human service practice will affect how you approach working in groups. I'm looking at slide 21, and if you're working, for example, from a psychoanalytic model, the group will be seen as a way of individuals resolving long-term personal problems. It will fit in that context. And if you work from an empowerment model, your group will probably be fairly self-directive, shared leadership, perhaps an even laissez-faire one, and run in a democratic way. I'm looking at slide 22 now, that if you're working from a problem-solving model, your group will generate cognitive activity that's really aimed at assisting people to change a problem, and given the goal that they're wanting to achieve and how they will actually get there. If you're working from a community development model, group work such as committees or neighbourhood groups, for example, they would be about creatively managing, working and mixing resources in a structured way to look at how to meet a community goal. If you're working from a Gestalt perspective, you'd be encouraging group members to maximise experiential learning and to take responsibility for their lives. So in each of those instances, you can see that the theory of group work will influence very much the approach to the work, the structure and also the role of the group leader or the group facilitator. The next quote is just from Corey and Corey, which is a great text, by the way, for this unit, if you're able to get hold of that. As experienced group workers, the authors in this quote are saying, we're sometimes asked to identify what theory we follow, but neither of us subscribes to any single theory in its totality. Rather, we function with an integrative framework. We continue to modify and develop as we practice. What they're talking about here as experienced group work leaders is that they are pulling their practice of group work, they're pulling from a number of different frameworks, and that they're always modifying and tweaking and developing as they go. One of the terms that's used to describe that is eclecticism. And when people talk about using an eclectic approach, they mean that they are using multiple theoretical models. But there's a word of caution there, because sometimes that can be used also to hide a weak theoretical base. In other words, I'm actually not really sure what model I'm drawing on, so I'll say that I'm using an eclectic approach. There's a caution here for students of group work dynamics to be aware that you're required to demonstrate a strong understanding of one theory first, and to have a good grounding in a particular theory as you approach group work. And then you're able to adapt it, choose one that may sit comfortably with your personality, but you need to be able to articulate and be able to talk about frameworks that are core framework that's going to influence your approach to group work. I'm just looking for the appropriate slide, which is a hat, which is slide 26. Like a hat fitting, when you try a new hat and you put different hats on your head, you see what they look like. You need to select which theory sits comfortably with you, which matches your values, which matches your approach, and that you are going to feel confident in using. You'll probably also notice that there's a number of other factors that influence which theory that you will use or draw on more strongly. Some of those things that you might want to think about are the context of where you're working. For example, if you are working in a prison and you are required to run groups around behaviour change, anger management, for example, for a group of men, and they have been told that they must come to your group, this will determine immediately what theory is going to be most useful in that setting. If you're running a group, for example, of parents who are wanting to get together and talk about the challenges that they're facing in raising their teenagers, and it's an optional group, parents can come if they want to, straight away this is going to influence what theory are you going to be able to draw on for running that group. So the context in which you're running a group, who the group is for, who your employer is, the setting, whether it's a mandatory or a voluntary group, all of these things are going to influence your theory of choice. On slide 27, we're just looking very briefly at planning. The purpose of group work, needing to be able to define what that is right at the outset, what the group is for, and what are going to be the tasks and the decisions that you need to make before a group begins. One of the things that we'll be talking about in more detail in Module 2 next week is about the planning, and that a lot of work and attention needs to happen at this stage, and a lot of workers focus very much on what they're going to do when people arrive and very much focus on the content of their group. There's a lot of planning that occurs before the group even starts, and some of those considerations about who the group is for and why, as I was just saying earlier, is it mandatory or voluntary? Are there resources? What resources are there to run the group? Why will people come? What will be the motivator for people to come? And how can you be sure that people will come? What do you need to consider for people to come, or to make it easy and accessible for people to come to the group? There's a lot of planning and thinking that goes into this stage, which we will talk about in some more detail. Finally, we're just looking on slide 29, group work and individual work. Going back to why is it that group work is seen as such a key tool for human service workers broadly to have? One of the powerful things that happens in group work is that there's an interaction that happens with different people when they're in a group situation about sharing power, sharing decision making, sharing life experience, sharing resources, that really places a type of multitude information flow that happens in group work. There's a lot of things that go on in group work, and that group work brings people together, and they can share in a democratic process. They can actually turn to each other and draw on each other's wisdom and knowledge and get help and support from each other. Having said that, the role of the group worker, of the group facilitator, is paramount in effective group work. And while there's a dynamic that is happening where people are interacting and sharing experiences and speaking with each other, ultimately the group worker, the group facilitator, is responsible for the effective running of that group. And often things change quickly in a group. Conflict can arise quickly. Someone can leave the room quickly because they're upset, and a group facilitator, group leader, has to respond to these situations. At the same time, they have to be paying attention to and concerned about the welfare of all the group members. Group work can be an ideal complement to individual work. One of the things that can happen in an individual work or a counselling situation is that a person with an issue can speak to their counsellor. They can go away, they can try new strategies, they can talk about their problem, and they can come back again the next week and they can address change in their life. What happens when someone actually is part of a group and they can talk about that same situation, they can talk about that same problem? A very powerful thing happens when they meet other people who have the same experience or the same situation, and people derive and get a lot of power and a lot of strength from sharing in common humanity and common human experience. That's where we're going to stop for this week, and I encourage you to go on to LearnLine and to find out the group that you are in if you haven't done so already, and scroll down to the bottom of the group that you're in and look at the discussion board and post your learning activity for Module 1, which is due on Monday the 1st of August. Okay, bye.